Next, from Springfield, we sit down with Garry Niemeyer, the past president of the National Corn Growers Association, and ask him about why he and other farmers are opposed to a new EPA rule that regulates bodies of water, the financial cost of entering the farming profession today, what advice he would provide to those considering a farming career, and the progress made so far to improve Illinois' lock and dam system. That's all just ahead, after a brief word from one of our advisory council members. This runs about 30 minutes.
Garry Niemeyer, thank you for joining us again on the Illinois Channel. We are gathered here today as far as wanting to catch up with you on a couple of agricultural issues. One of them is the EPA trying to propose a new rule that would impact water. And I'll tell the viewers before we get started, this is something that does not impact just farmers, that it could impact people in a subdivision where there's runoff. We'll get into the details of it. You're the former head of the Corn Growers Association of America, and are farming here just outside of on the outskirts of Springfield, Illinois. So from your connections, you're tied in, as I would imagine, with farmers across America. So you're not speaking, on one hand, you're speaking as an individual, but you know of which you speak, and you're tied in with others from around the country who have the same concerns about this rule. Is that right?
There is a lot of concern by farmers and homeowners both, just like you said, about what this new rule will mean to them. It's vaguely written. It's called the WOTUS rule, Waters of the U.S. And unfortunately, it doesn't really follow any kind of scientific principle. It's vulnerable to a lot of lawsuits, both to the EPA, the Army Corps of Engineers, as well as to individuals, because of the vagueness of the written rule. And at best, it would be that, and at worst, it would be a power grab by an agency of the federal government to control any kind of water in the future.
So, as everyone knows, the EPA is a regulatory agency. The Environmental Protection Acts created the agency. This is so, so we want them on one hand to be regulating water. We don't want dirty water. We don't want people polluting the water. What is the concern? Let's get into some of the details. What's the concern with what they're trying to do? And again, government is famous for using these acronyms. So we're going to use the term WOTUS, which means Waters of the United States.
Correct. That's exactly right.
What is the rule they're changing, and why specifically are you concerned about it?
And essentially in the past, it used to be termed navigable waters. That meant a water connected to another water. And now the WOTUS refers to any kind of large rain event.
Let me interject if I might. Well, I think it used to be that their EPA's ability to regulate waters was limited to navigable waterways.
Exactly.
So Mississippi, the Illinois River, etc.
Yes.
And so, I'm sorry, I just wanted to clarify that.
Okay.
So they're changing the terminologies and expanding through a rulemaking process, not by a law of Congress, what waters they're going to have the ability to regulate.
And while you're there, Congress, the House of Representatives have turned down this rule and says legal, it needs to be redone. And you also need to have people from the local EPAs, the state EPAs, as well as interested individuals in the community help be a part of writing this rule. And that is one of our big concerns. This was pretty much thrown in the face, and it was set up that all they had to do was put it in the Federal Register in the month of August, and it automatically became law, August 28th. And that's the reason that there's so many people up in arms. It's already has a House of Representative vote against it to deny it, which would be binding in the fact that it would override a presidential veto. And currently, because it came up so quickly, and a lot of congressmen and senators are trying to get reelected, they have not had a vote in the Senate as of yet. But we feel like we have 54 votes, which is enough to pass the legislation, but we need 60 to override a presidential veto of this specific legislation.
So the EPA already put it in the Federal Register. So And again, as you just said, I know that a lot of viewers may not follow the workings of Congress. They're typically on an August recess. So
Yes.
that went in the register in August. So therefore, the Senate, which had been out, had not had a chance to come back as yet and take up a vote on this.
That's correct.
And in essence, if I could boil this down, so the EPA would, by a rulemaking change, go from regulating waters in streams to regulating almost any water, and what I think you would
Correct.
argue is even in a spring rain where you have water sitting in a farmer's field, that all of a sudden, where that's certainly not navigable, now under this rule change, that could be subject to regulation by the EPA. Or a heavy runoff that might be going through a neighborhood where a southern, I mean, all of a sudden, that might be designated to be regulated. And if it were so that that runoff was being regulated, then someone might come in and say, we could sue the homeowners association because you people have been putting too much nitrogen on your green lawns, and therefore you're collectively polluting the waterways of the United States.
Exactly. And this is what makes it so onerous, because there's no really rule set in stone other than, well, let me get right to the point. How they determine this is a bed, a bank, and an ordinary high water mark. And they can come back in and determine that historically it could have been an ephemeral stream, which means in the past at some time it could have been made to be a stream that directed water into another body of water that would have affected it dramatically. And then they have tried to put in unscientific background, and they've used the terms of it has to be cannot be within 1,500 foot of an existing stream. And then there's another term they've talked about, 4,000 foot of a large, massive water body. The point is, there's no scientific data to prove this. There's nothing in it, and it kind of overrides this Clean Water Act, Section 404. And ironically, EPA asked the Army Corps of Engineers to get involved in this, and after the rule has come out, the Secretary of the Corps of Engineers said, we don't want to have any part in it. We don't think it's legally binding. We don't think it's got any potential to follow any scientific data. And we don't want our names attached to this piece of legislation at all, or proposed regulation.
Now, we already said that this rule went into the Federal Register, which would be something then ostensibly one would have to follow, but I think wasn't there a judicial ruling on that put a hold on it?
There's been several. Originally there were about 13 commodity organizations that signed and wanted to have the rule rewritten. Then there were 18 states that signed and said, we want to have a stay on this piece of legislation, this piece of regulation, because it doesn't match up with the concerns that we would have from a legal standpoint. And then just recently, I think October the 7th, I think it was the 6th District Court came out and said they're going to put a stay on this piece of legislation. And so I can get it exactly right, the Circuit Court of Appeals put a stay on the WOTUS implementation. The stay allows for a more deliberate determination whether this exercise of executive power is proper under the dictates of federal law. And now it was also a concern that would the 18 states be separated from this law, or would all the states of the United States be impacted by what happens?
When you talk to your fellows in the agricultural community, what kind of reactions are you getting from them?
Irate would be the first. Power grab would probably be the second. Lawsuit implementation ruling that, and the problem is it's not written appropriately enough that it would pass legal muster. And this is what the Army Corps of
Because
Engineers
the language, as you said, is already so vague that if it were to be implemented with such vague language,
absolutely.
You wouldn't know if you're in violation of the rule or not. It's not even a law, but it would have the power of law.
Exactly.
You wouldn't know if you're violating or not. Now, it's also true, I would say, you tell me if I'm right, you can't be a farmer in modern America without putting chemicals on your fields.
It's next to impossible. Yes.
And so therefore, that water that's going to be standing on your field is going to be tainted with chemicals that were put on the field.
It's not so much that, Terry, is the fact that most chemicals and most fertilizer attach to soil particles. And when you have these large rains, those dirt soil particles are washed off the field. That's what they're very most concerned about, because the particles contain the chemical and the fertilizer.
So therefore, I'm not sure how they would assign guilt from a soil particle.
Well, I don't know. God, I don't know. Did you make it rain today that you're creating a WOTUS for me?
So the concern would be that therefore you could get a knock from someone from the federal EPA saying you're a violation of WOTUS under the new regulations that they've implemented through a rulemaking process.
Absolutely.
And we're going to fine you X number of dollars and you better pay up or we're going to tack on some penalties.
You know what's really strange about this, and I just thought about it, I was looking up and saying, God, why did you make it rain? You realize the EPA dumped a bunch of water in the state of Colorado into a river. And I thought it was just so overwhelmingly interesting to hear the secretary make the comment. She said, well, not to worry about this, nature will take care of itself. And now they tried to implement WOTUS, which is the government's going to take care of it, not nature.
Now, Gary, as we just mentioned, as a farmer, everyone I think already understands that you have to replenish the soil, and so you put nutrients on there in various forms.
Exactly.
I know before when I was doing local news in Decatur, Illinois, one of the concerns back then was the spring rains would bring nitrogen into the water reservoir, which is how the communities in central Illinois get their water. Mm-hmm. And they're going to be exposed to water coming in, and it's, as we just mentioned, bringing soil in from off the farmers' fields. Occasionally you would get a spike in the nitrogen levels mm-hmm. that might last for a relatively short period of time, and then it would be diffused. How big of an issue is this still for farmers?
Well, it's a very big issue, and Terry, I am a part of the Lake Springfield watershed, and I farm in that area. It covers pretty much all of central and south Sangamon counties, and a part of Morgan and a part of Macoupin. In 2012, we had a drought, so a lot of the nitrogen and other fertilizers was not utilized in the crop. And then the spring of 2013, we had a real wet spring, and our Lake Springfield water here locally spiked up to 8.8 on a nitrogen test, and when it gets to 10,
what should they be?
10 or below. But normally, I mean, like now, we're probably writing about 2, mm-hmm. 1 or 2. It's relatively low because there's water coming in and out of the lake all the time, and the summer warmth, denitrites.
So we get a concern if it goes above 10.
Yes.
Okay.
And the concern was that it could create what's known, the term is blue babies in mothers.
Blue baby syndrome, which
yes.
impacts infants from basically birth to about 6 months, where
yes.
Theoretically it could inhibit their ability to take in oxygen, so they turn blue.
Exactly. And the point
it's
is...
very rare that
rare.
actually happens. In fact, it's been argued that a mother eating a Polish sausage would take in more nitrates than through the water.
That's true, but we've been talking about lawsuits today, and you can understand the concern. This City Water, Light and Power would have had to put in a $10 million scrubber to clean up the water, and/or...
If it had gone over 10.
Yes, and/or pass out bottled water to anybody with infants or small children. during that time frame, and it never did. So we passed by on that. But as farmers, we're very concerned about that. So we've done what we have called nutrient management. And what we're doing, in the past, we would apply our anhydrous ammonia about this time of the year, usually around the 1st of November. And when we do that, it goes in the ground, and we have in-serve some form of nitrogen stabilizer so it doesn't go out into the air. We try to keep the ground temperature at the 4-inch level at 10 o'clock in the morning below 50. It will not, nitrogen doesn't actively get going until it gets above 50. It goes from anhydrous ammonia to nitrate to nitrite. And nitrite is what we use in our crops. So what we've decided to do is back away from the application of anhydrous ammonia. We're going back from, maybe 200 pounds all the way back down to about 130 for our own farm. So we're cutting that almost in half. But we're putting nitrogen on later in the growing season.
So you might avoid the spring rains.
A lot of it. And the corn plant does not really need the nitrogen until it gets to be about a foot tall. It only uses 15% of the total.
Can you go through the
nitrogen.
field when the crop is a foot tall?
Yes, we have new application methods. We can do that. And what we're doing is trying to get the fertilizer closer to the time frame the plant needs it the most. And ironically, we have had increase in yields of 10 to 15% doing this thing. Now, we're not using any more nitrogen. We're not using any less. We're just changing the timing of it.
Let me, if I might, before I want to go to a different topic, but let me back up for a minute. Relative to WOTUS, and we said there's a stay on that. What's going to happen there? So you got a House bill that passed. The Senate might take up a companion bill, and then they'd have to go to conference. But if the Congress passes the legislation, then I guess the EPA would have to go back to the drawing board as far as the rule that would invalidate it.
Absolutely. And I do want to point out that I'm fairly sure that they didn't get any consultation from states' EPAs in their determination of the final rule, and we tried to work with them.
Have you talked to the Illinois EPA to determine, what did they say?
I'm not going to say exactly what they said, but they weren't consulted that heavily at all.
Let me move on. Something, in a previous conversation we had, I think you had mentioned that the average farmer was 57 years old. I don't know if that's maybe more or less accurate still. But the concern is for a lot of industries, and I want to see about agriculture, that with the retirement of the baby boomers, that there may not be people in the pipeline to fill those positions. And farming has become such an expensive proposition to get into that you have the land around Central Illinois is about $15,000 an acre, I'm told.
Well, it's a little less now because the price of corn's come down, but still it's 13.
13,000. So if you're going to have 1,000 acres, let's say, is that a fair amount of? You're not going to start be a farmer with 100 acres.
No.
So you're at $1.3 million just for the purpose or purchase, I should say, of the land. What would a combine go for? In other words, when you add it all up, you're probably looking at what, at a $2 million at a minimum to kind of get into the farming game?
Let me start from the top. In the next 10 years, it's expected that 70% of the current farmers will not be farming.
70%.
70%. And that's because of demographics and age. I'm 67. I'm not going to be farming in 10 years. I can tell you that. Hopefully in 5, but maybe not in 10. But going on to your second question, just for machinery, and we farm 2,000 acres, it would be 1 to 1.5 million just for the machinery to farm that. And then if you cash rent ground, because you don't farm on 100 acres, you have to farm at least 1,000. And I think you were a little off. It's more like 13 million, not 1.3 million, if you put your zeros in line.
Yeah, wow. Yeah.
So the point is, even if you cash rented the ground, it's still $400 an acre. And
just to lease the ground.
Yes. And I don't see any young person energetic enough to want to go out and borrow $2 million and take a chance that they'll break even, which there are a lot of farmers this year are going to struggle with just breaking even because we've had 2 or 3 fairly decent crops in a row and the price of corn's come down so dramatically. And unfortunately in this area we had spring rains and then a summer drought of sorts, and our yields are not anywhere like they were a year ago. In fact, we're practically almost 60 to 70 bushel off where we were this time last year in yield.
You say the price of corn has come down.
Yes.
How much has it dropped?
Well, not so much from last year to this year. So our yields are really impacted, and you have to take price times yield. But we used to have $5, $6, $7 corn in the last 3 to 5 years, and now we're, well, I think right now 375 minus, it's about $3.50 to 65 cents a bushel locally. And that doesn't pay any bills. I'm sorry. One of the things.
Well, it might pay the bills, but it doesn't get you into the black, I guess. Right?
Exactly.
You're just trading dollars, and you ended up working a lot for nothing.
Exactly. And I don't know, in today's society, there's a lot more concern about somebody taking care of you, the big government logic that I'm not so sure I buy into necessarily. But from a, you've seen farmersonly.com where you have to be here to understand what it's like to borrow $500,000. You have to pay that back first before you make any money, and sometimes there's just not enough to make any money. And really, we've been very fortunate since 1987 to probably about a year ago. We have made money in farming practically every year. But now we're getting in a downturn. And I remember it because I bought a lot of farmland in 1979, and we went from 79 to 87 before we started seeing black ink again. So this is not uncommon. This is just a part of the business.
Should we as consumers, I mean, as people who eat, should we be concerned? Or is there the argument that the ground's still going to be there? It's just a question of who farms it. And maybe the issue is that you're losing the family farm, but what is the trend that, I guess the question is this, are family farmers going to be replaced by corporate farms, or are those who remain as independent farmers just going to take over the land that maybe their neighbor sold when they retired?
That's a good question. I've posed it to a lot of people. If it gets to be corporation farming, ironically, I was in Germany this year, and I saw East Germany and I saw West Germany, 2 different Germanys.
Still?
Yeah. There were larger farms in East Germany, and even to this day, they're farmed differently than they are in East Germany, and it was just night and day difference.
How big what was the kind of a difference? How big was a farm in East Germany?
East German farms, gosh, they were massive. They were 200, 300, 400 acres. And you would find in West Germany more like 60 to 80, 40, 60, and 80 acres farms.
I would have thought the opposite, actually.
Yeah, well, when the communists controlled East Germany, they made them in larger farms, and they were farming like they do in Russia.
I see. So again, should we be concerned, or
well, I think there's concerns out there for everybody, but for the most part, family farm corporations have really picked up the pace so far. Now, if they get in trouble, then that's a different story. But I'm not really sure. I mean, you have a lot of large chemical companies, you have a lot of large machinery companies that it would behoove them to make sure that they have some involvement, because it's their products that's being used in the farming industry.
And as we close out, what would you how would you say is the state of farming as far as someone wanting to get into it? What would you advise someone who's a young person thinking of getting into farming?
Well, really and truly, I would hope that we would find a bunch of young people who are interested in getting involved in farming. It's just a very, you almost have to have a family, a base, or try to work with somebody who is currently in farming and get into that base operation, because it's almost prohibitive financially just to go out on your own and start farming. Now, there are a lot of smaller co-ops, and there's a lot of organic farming going on these days, and it's smaller acreage, and they do a lot of hand labor, and it's a different story altogether. But it's more vegetables and stuff that you would maybe see in a country market of sorts.
You know, since you brought that up, I would say one of the interesting aspects was just that I, some years ago, was talking to a farmer who grew corn, but he had a vegetable stand on a road that had a lot of traffic. And he said that he was selling tomatoes and cucumbers and all the vegetables stand. He said, Terry, I make more money off those 4 acres of vegetables than off the 400 acres of corn.
Well, I hate to tell you this, but there's a new law being implemented in Illinois even, very similar to Colorado, and it's growing marijuana. And I'd make more money in my garden out there 4 to 5 to 1 than I do farming 2,000 acres. So there's a lot of truth to that.
The corn that we're growing, where's it going to? Is that the animal feed primarily?
Yeah, mainly 80+% of the corn that we grow goes into livestock feed in one form or another, either exported or domestically. Only about 8% of the corn we grow goes into corn meal, corn starch, corn oil, food products. So the majority of it is livestock feed.
And some of it is like corn sweeteners, and that goes into Coca-Cola and that kind of thing. Or, and then lastly, and I will end up with this, but something else that we had talked about in the past, and maybe you can give us an update. The locks and dams along the Mississippi and the, well, I guess all of them really, the Ohio, the Illinois. There's something, I think, I may have the number wrong, but something like 27 locks and dams from the upper Mississippi north of St. Louis, because frankly the Mississippi doesn't have enough water in it to float the barges without damming and raising the water level.
Exactly.
But those were built back in the, like,
They're
70
about
years
70
ago.
years ago, it's the last 50 years, and they're deteriorating. We were very fortunate. We passed a WRDA bill this year.
And
then
WRDA stands for?
Water Resources Development Act. I'm sorry, I should have known that. Anyway, those bills used to come every 2 years, and now it's been about every 7 because there's not a lot of money to implement the programs. One of the very important things we did, we were very fortunate to get I say tax, but it's not, is an increase in the fee for utilizing the water system. And by that,
So would the barge operators pay a higher fee for going through the docks?
Barge operators have been paying 20 cents a gallon for diesel fuel to operate their barge, or to operate their system within the system. And we got that up to 29 cents. Okay, that was a hit that we had to pay. But in the United States, all of our water systems, which kind of goes back to WOTUS, making you wonder the control that we have within the system, all the water locks and dams are all federally controlled by the Army Corps of Engineers. And for us to build new locks, we have to come up with half the money. And when I say we, I'm talking about the people who utilize the river system, the barge operators, and essentially a barge operator, yes, he had a 9-cent increase in his fee, but if he hauls corn, it increases our cost of hauling corn, shipping the corn, maybe a cent a bushel with this.
But so collectively it adds up to
we're paying for it.
So is that money going to go to, so are we going to get locks and dams built now, or where do we say?
The chances are greater that we get them built sooner rather than later. Originally they were on books for 2023 for the very first one, the first one of the 27, and we only have 7 that we can upgrade and build. But by increasing that from 20 cents to 29 cents, we'll decrease the amount of time. And we pay for half of all the construction comes from this Inland Waterway Trust Fund, and we can start in 2018 now.
Well,
that's a huge increase.
That's a huge difference. And people should know this is not just an agricultural thing. We have, if you're living in Chicago, a lot of the jet fuel that's used at O'Hare comes up those waterways, so we need to have those locks and dams available. Otherwise, the cost of doing any number of things is going to be prohibitively high, because you'd have to be moving it either through rail or through trucks, and
yes.
You're just not, barges can move such much greater volume of things like coal and jet fuel and corn.
And more environmentally friendly too, because they don't use half the amount of, fourth amount of fuel as these other forms, plus road construction and everything else.
You don't have all that weight on your roads. The trucks would be expanded greatly if that were the case.
And like you were beginning to say, there are no locks south of Alton all the way down to the end of the Mississippi, because at Alton, the Missouri River comes into the Mississippi, and 60% of the water from there on south comes out of the Missouri River. So it's from Alton, Illinois, up north, and we have 7 locks in the state of Illinois and 27 on the Mississippi. But we're trying to get the ones at the bottom of the chain that do the most work replaced sooner than the ones at the top. And all of them need to be replaced. They were built to last 50 years and they're 70 to 80 years old right now.
Yeah, it's an ongoing story with the rebuilding the infrastructure of the United States, and for too long in a variety of ways. We've been kind of living off the investment that was made in the 1940s and 50s, but we need to put some money back in.
Isn't that amazing? And they still work.
Yeah, they still work. But they have to be expanded as well.
Absolutely.
They need to go from 600 feet to 1,200
1,200
feet.
foot, yes.
So, well, Garry Niemeyer, always good to talk to you. I'm sorry we never get to visit quite as often as we want, but we appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Terry.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.